As the title suggests, this video will go over the 10 largest non-player characters or things in WoW that have been given names. And I excluded things that grow bigger with buffs, so only their base models count. The way I decided the list was to simply find out what other people thought were the biggest things in WoW, and then I went out and measured them. Note, I wasn't super strict in my measuring, so the numbers are probably a little off, or way off, but they give a good enough ballpark number to compare each other to. Now let's get started. Number 10, Thrym, the Hopebender. Big ass giant thing that walks around Zoldrak. According to this comment I found on Wowhead, in Norse mythology, King Primer, also known as Thrym, or Uproar in English, of the Frost Giants stole Thor's hammer to extort the gods into giving him Freyja as his wife. He was later then super murdered by Thor in retaliation. Thrym from WoW is basically just an abomination created from the corpses of storm giants though. He doesn't really have a complicated backstory like what his name is based on. Now, just how big is he? Well, I use my undead mage as a base for all of my measurements. I took my mage and took a screenshot as close to his foot as possible with a neutral angle. Then measured how many of my mage I could fit in his foot. Then I measured his body by how many feet in relation to his own foot Thrym was. And after my rough estimations were complete, Thrym came out to about 20 times bigger than my mage. Or as I'll be saying from now on, 20 times bigger than a player character. To give this some perspective, Archimonde from the Battle for Mount Hyjal, notable for being an especially big raid boss, is only about 10 times bigger than a player character. The Fellreaver from Outlands, another notably large NPC, is only about 16 times bigger than a player. So Thrym dwarfs both of them, but not by very much for the Fellreaver at least. Number 9, Supremus, second boss from Black Temple. By my rough calculations, Supremus is about 27 times bigger than the average player, making him 7 player characters bigger than Thrym. And until Wrath of the Lich King, Supremus was probably the biggest NPC in game, and is currently the biggest infernal demon in game. Number 8, Kologarn, the 6th boss in Ulduar. At first look, he doesn't seem that much bigger than the other NPCs I've talked about so far, until you look at his full model in WoW Model Viewer. This guy has some really long, lanky legs. He's all torso. Someone only ever worked out their glamour muscles. If you take his full body into account, he's about 30 times bigger than the average player character. Really, not that much bigger than Supremus. Now, there are 2 other massive bosses where you only fight their torso, Kromog in Blackrock Foundry and Crossus in Nighthold, both of whom would have been a much bigger pain in the ass to measure than Cologarn. So I'm just going to assume they're about the same size as Cologarn and just lump them all together in this spot. Number 7, Whale Sharks. I'm just kind of putting all whale sharks into the same category and assuming they're all about the same size. The whale shark I took for measuring was one of the ones in Vashj'ir. I did a rough estimate of my character in relation to its tail, and then used that as a base for the rest of its body. The whale shark came out to about 56 times bigger than the average player character. Very large, most likely some of the biggest NPCs out in the world, but not the biggest obviously. Number 6, the Spine of Deathwing. Now this was a tough one to measure, and I'm not all that confident in my assessment. Spine of Deathwing is bigger than the normal Deathwing you see out in RP events and shit, so I had to go on Spine to compare it to my mage. I got him as close to his plates as I could, and guessed them to be about 3 times bigger than my mage. Then I opened the Spine of Deathwing dungeon file in WoW Model Viewer, and roughly estimated the length of Deathwing with its plate as a base, and came out to a figure of about 75 times bigger than the average player character. About 2.5 times bigger than Kologarn, but that makes sense seeing as the raid fight takes place on his back, whereas Cologarn just kinda turns into a short bridge on his death. Number 5, the Iron Colossus in Storm Peaks, coming in at about 110 times bigger than the average player. I did my measurements on the inactive model since it stands still and doesn't attack me, But I went ahead and did the long quest chain to double check its real size when it moves, and it's about the same. The whole quest chain with the Iron Colossus just has you trying to stop it from being built, and when that fails, you have to fight it with worms, acid, or something. But as long as you don't complete the last quest in this chain, it just wanders around in a small little area, being almost as big as the mountains around it. Number 4, AlAkir, final boss of the Throne of Four Winds. AlAkir is the largest boss in the game, seeing as during the third phase of the fight, you have to fly around him. He needed to be big for the environmental aspect of his fight. I remember back in Cataclysm when doing this fight on my Disc Priest, I couldn't use Atonement on this fight because back then, Atonement would only heal people who were within 15 yards of the target you attacked, and not even the tanks and melee were counted as being within 15 yards of AlAkir's base. Since Atonement would use the center of the boss as its range, and not the actual hitbox of the boss before it was changed later on, which really pissed me off and made me hate the fight, but it was eventually fixed, like, after we had already progressed on the fight, so it didn't really matter to me anymore. Plus, Atonement wasn't all that great back then, so it wasn't a super big deal, just an inconvenience. Now, how big is the boss? Well, by my estimates, about 144 times bigger than the average player character. Way bigger than I thought he'd be. Number 3, ISO Wrath, or ISO Wrath. ISO Wrath isn't really an NPC and more of an environmental thing, but this giant gaping hole in the Twilight Highlands is given a name, does have a bunch of tentacles that it controls, has a brain, and will try to digest you if you're inside its stomach, so it kinda counts. So just how much bigger is it than the average player? Well, by my rough estimates, I think it's about 170 times bigger. As you can see from the images on screen, I had to measure its top and inside separately, and then I just kinda guessed what its mouth was since I couldn't really get a good faraway shot of it. I should also note that the rooms you find Yorsaj and Zanas and Dragon Soul are very similar to ISO Wrath, and are even bigger. I didn't count them though, since they don't have as many character traits as ISO Wrath or even names, but they are basically the same thing. It is stated in the quest chain that what we saw in the Twilight Highlands wasn't even his full power. He had just sprouted from the ground when we killed it, and had the potential to grow even bigger, as you could probably see from the Dragon Soul rooms, as they are much larger. Number 2, Nespirah and L'ghorek, 2 massive creatures in Vashj'ir. So big that they even appear on the map like a city would. Both of these giant ancients are living things, and even talk to you as you help them with kicking the Naga and Twilight Hammer cult out of their bodies. You can enter both of their bodies for the different quest chains involving them. In this image, you can even see a whale shark swimming by Nespirah, an NPC that appeared on this list earlier, showing you just how much bigger it is. So, just how big are they? I'm going to put them both together since they're basically the same size. I went ahead and measured how tall each one was and got a rough estimate of about 182 times bigger than player characters. But seeing as these things are more box-shaped than they are tall, that doesn't really give a good scope of how big they truly are. Since at 182 times taller than the average player character, they're only about 25% bigger than AlAkir, even though they are clearly much, much larger. So I think it's safe to just double that number, since it might actually be wider than it is tall, and just say they're about 364 times bigger than the average player. Very big, but still not as big as number 1. Number 1, Shen-zin Su. For those of you who have never made a Pandaren, which is most of you, seeing as pandas are by far the least played race, the starting zone takes place on the back of a giant turtle named Shen-zin Su. Now, this turtle might be the biggest thing in game, but is not the biggest thing in lore. That would most likely go to Sargeras, as he's the only Titan left alive. But he's never appeared in-game, whereas Shen-zin Su is. Now, just how big is this turtle? Well, luckily for me, there was a landmark close to his head, which allowed me to measure my Pandaren next to a hot air balloon, which was about 7 times bigger than my character. I then used that hot air balloon as a base to see how tall the turtle is, which came out to about 91 times taller than the average player. If that were my only measurement, he'd be at number 6 instead of spine. Now let's take a look at the turtle lengthwise. Luckily for me, I have a machinima tool and my own sandbox server that allows me to free roam the turtle, which is in a no-fly zone, and greatly reduce the fog view distance to get myself a full shot of the turtle lengthwise. With this side view, the hot air balloon is too small to use as a base, so instead I just use the hot air balloon to measure out the head of the turtle, and then use the length of the turtle's head as my base and do my usual ghetto math to get my measurements. And Shen-zin Su comes out to about 637 times bigger than the average player, with his head being 49 times bigger lengthwise. That's one big turtle. Of course, if you go behind the smoke and mirrors and look underneath the turtle, you'll see that it literally is just an island with turtle parts added to the sides and the sea moving on a loop to make it seem like it's moving. So what do you think? Did I miss a big NPC who dwarfs one of the NPCs in this video? Is there something bigger than Shen-zin Su in-game with its own model? Do you think I should have used an actual measurement tool instead of just guessing? You can go ahead and let me know in the comments or something.